So we need to wait on the approval of board meetings and the consent agenda. I think I can ask this question though without us voting. Does anyone have any questions about the items on the consent agenda? So that way, once we pick up Andreas, we can just go ahead and vote. All right. And what's this number 5, information item?
Those are just to keep the board informed of some of the purchases, the large purchases that we have made under the task orders.
Okay.
Come to the board. We sometimes come with a large item, and then when we purchase things under the task order, we just want to be transparent and make the board aware that we purchase.
Okay, so do you want to go ahead and do that? The task order and recent and upcoming procurement?
Sure. I can get to it. Yes. So the first task order was under our RK&K contract, and we've issued a task order for the engineering and inspection services for the environmental and remediation of the church property over here at 325 East Belt Boulevard. And that amount is $323,540. So that was one task order. And then the other one is just under our Colonial Web contract where we did some plumbing services, and that's $313,240. So those were the two that we did during the month of September that we wanted to make the board aware of. And then the only other thing on the recent and upcoming procurements is we always make the rest of the board aware of anything that the chairman has signed that's over $50,000 but less than $100,000. And that was the business management research, which is support services for procurement. Since they are short-staffed, we use a consultant to assist with some of the purchases. So we issued that, and that's for $65,000. Other than that, that's it.
All right, thank you. Bill, did Ellen join us?
I'm with you, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Sorry. Took me a while to get through.
We all will know. All the Chesterfield people on time. The rest of us were late. So let's go ahead to the board meeting items, and then once our colleagues join us, then we can just vote real quickly on the board meeting minutes and the consent agenda.
And the remote participation.
And a remote participation. So do you have that motion to read? Is there a motion that we have to read for that or what?
We can't do that until we have.
No, I know, but I'm saying once they come.
I don't have one, but we can
Yeah, we'll
walk
just,
through
yeah.
it when we get there.
See.
So you want to wait till you get up here or?
We can get this out of the way.
Sure. See. Two from each jurisdiction. You have just this was our turn to make up for the last time this meeting.
All good. All good.
Now, we do, but we need to.
Just for purposes,
Especially when online person, you have
Right?
All right, so now we can move forward. Let's start with the remote participation first. So can we get a motion to accept the remote?
So moved.
Hold on, I'm
I'm trying to save you.
Board member Robertson has asked to participate remotely due to the fact that she has a family member who is ill and requires her care today. So we need a motion to allow the remote participation for that reason.
Moved and I'll second it.
all right. So a motion moved and second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you. Minute approval from August 29th. Can we get a motion? Second. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, motion made and second. All in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Consent agenda. We already asked any questions. Did you have any questions about consent agenda items? All right. Can we get a motion to accept the consent agenda?
Second.
All right, motion made and second. All in favor, say aye. Any opposed? All right, there we go. Board retreat. Dan, you missed nothing but
There's plenty of food behind there.
95.
He said, Todd texted back and said, I'm in the red zone. I sent a picture. You said, I'm in the red zone.
there, like, yeah.
You know how hard it was not to say Mr. Nelson wishes the Cowboys could say that more often. It was close. I did not. But
The sort of thing you
yeah, I wanted to say it for everybody.
I think you just did.
Yeah.
Necessarily, shots fired.
He didn't specifically say that. He just hinted around at it.
More of you too, Dan. I'm gonna take a quick photo of you all like you're in the act before Adrian starts.
Well, hold on, let me get,
Sounding like we haven't started.
put this donut over here with mine.
By the way,
Yeah, I know, congratulations.
Can bring her back.
We're gonna just put all this food over each.
Well, that was in there.
I didn't know what it was.
You don't have to stay.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. So we would like to officially congratulate Sharika on permanent executive director of RideFinders. New and good things with our van pool, carpool program through Sharika. So, thank you.
Now you can go.
All right, good morning, everyone. This is gonna be a tag team effort for myself. We have Scudder Wag here. He is from Jarrett Walker and Associates, as well as John will be helping out as well. And I don't anticipate us being here the full 11 o'clock hour, but depending on conversation, we are going to jump into
Next. You might want to tell you still.
And I can beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so we're gonna go over FY24, just kind of close it out and kind of go over some things that we accomplished, some celebrations that we did in that particular year. FY25, we'll jump into what the projects and plans that we are looking forward to this year. And then we're gonna dive into FY25 through FY34. Main purpose of that is to look at our 10-year, look at all of it kind of budgetary in terms of service plans, capital projects, what we can anticipate for needed funds, and have a lot of conversation around that and some policy discussion. Then we are set to go.
Adrian, can I ask you a question? Can we, whatever you're gonna show us as it relates to celebration and accomplishments, can we actually get that? Can we get a copy of that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Actually, a video.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I want to be able to share this stuff too, so. Thank you. And don't you like the Giants?
Yes.
Did y'all win or something this
I'm
week?
currently letting other teams audition for my support right now.
Okay.
Yeah, the Giants.
I mean, they're just kind of, I mean, I took it straight from a Giants fan. Just like out of the blue.
They lost to the Commanders with no kicker.
Yeah.
I mean, opening kickoff, or that was rough.
Well, that's all the Commanders had.
That's exactly right. And 7 field goals.
Hey, it just kept the guy from the week before. You know?
That's exactly right. Opening kickoff and chasing again. Then ironically, we lost to 7 field goals. Literally 7.
You know, it's the only time ever a team scored 3 touchdowns and not allowed a touchdown and lost.
Okay.
It's true. It's a true fact.
Giants.
How do you get 18 points with no field goals?
Don't have a kicker.
Almost took your other half there, Bonnie. I almost took your other half.
Almost took the other
I almost did.
All right, if you guys can give this a try, sorry. I don't know. You can either, with your phones, or your iPad, I think that should work as well. If you could either scan the QR code or go to you.
You get up close on.
I think I should make it big.
They're not coming up. Oh,
There you go.
so you don't adjust.
Yep.
Oh, I got it. Have it.
It's telling me it's powered by,
That code is up there too.
Numbers.
It's at the top.
says it's powered by Mentimeter. Take me to it.
Okay, let me.
Got that. That's what you got, right? Scroll.
Basically,
We'll come
basically
back
it
to
says,
this.
it says you're almost there.
Not the same when you started.
This is powered by.
All right, well, we will come back to that. Let's go ahead and play this for you guys for a second. So one of the celebrations is Dexter, sorry, I'm failing on the road.
I think you're just giving me time to get some coffee.
Should just jump. Not giving it. Just play with shit.
So your QR code opened it up.
No, I got
It said,
Save that. Download that for video. Can you do that online?
While we're waiting.
Oh, you did.
Do you know what the code was?
all those pictures changed. Thank you. Damn.
That's 6464 number.
1337.
6464.
64.
It just takes you to the power.
Yeah.
yeah,
No, it did exactly what you said.
Here.
All I did was send emails that I needed, so I didn't look at it. There's such a security. Turn off my volume.
Our marketing department, yeah. As you can see, we did a lot of eating together. All right. Staff cooked and had a cookout. Food trucks. We tried to do something each other.
So they could hear the sound.
Jump into the accomplishments and then I'll come back to the question. All right, so we celebrated our 50th anniversary, but we also had a lot to do in FY24. So this kind of just gives us not necessarily in any sort of order, but we had a goal to get at least 300 operators. We met that. We put all of our service levels back that we strategically thought were necessary. We were able to implement all 5 zones for the microtransit pilots. We have started the next phase for both our north-south and western BRT and closed out the first phases. We have done some shelter installations and we're able to put in order for the 50 that we'll get in by the end of the year. We have begun work on the study, at least preliminary, for off-street. That is the kickoff of the downtown transfer station, the temporary one. We were able to continue zero fares. We had our first partner from Sheltering Arms for our transit access partnership program to go towards zero fare. We were able to successfully have a new union contract set in record time. New microtransit division set up through an MOU with the union, which was very exciting to make that an in-house service. Very successful rodeo. We revamped and reestablished our rider advisory committee. That was something that had been closed since COVID. 19 new buses was a successful grant from a competitive grant from FTA. We expanded service into Chesterfield all the way to Walmart Way, Chesterfield Town Center. We finally made it to Sheltering Arms in Goochland. Route 19 was able to get 15-minute frequency all the way to Short Pump back in January. We had a ridership record year for GRTC with about 10.5 million riders. We completed our triannual review for FTA with minimal findings. We successfully managed the largest operating budget in GRTC history, successful with over 50 million grants to go towards capital as well as towards operating. We are a LEED building, which has been very challenging, and our HVAC system, I mean, it was sometimes 90 degrees in here. So we were able to successfully get that finally replaced before summer started. And then both finance and HR were needed areas for expansion and restructuring, and that happened in all in FY24. I'm trying to go back, if it will let me. And
Yeah, that looks right. That looks better.
let's start this one. All right. Yes. Yep. Those are great descriptors. All right, you guys want to hear it from the staff side? Sure. So we did a retreat in July, or June, with staff and asked them the same question.
Understand, yep.
But it led to what you guys have as your view of how the year went, which is what we want. Yeah.
No, that was the accident.
All right, I'm just going to close out. 2024, just showing the ridership and actually showing a little bit of a peek of what's happening for FY25 so far this year. You can see green was FY24. We surpassed every other year, zero fare expansion, all that working hand in hand for made the 10.5 million. And you can see how FY25 is already starting off substantially higher in the first 2 months than any other year we've ever had. All right, so as far as what's happening in FY25, we have some more expansion we have planned. Route 1 will be going all the way to Virginia Center Commons in October, so next month actually. Same with our Route 7A and 7B, those will increase so that there will be 15-minute frequency on 9 Mile Road up to kind of White Oak Village, Walmart area. And then, actually those are the kind of the biggest ones. There are 2 additional micro transit zones that are coming online, but those will not happen in May or June. This just shows those 2 minutes. Major projects and kind of a little bit of update where we are with those. The demo and paving of the, I'm calling it the fleet storage lot, 325 East Gulf Boulevard, is aimed to be completed by spring 2025. By the end of the month, we will actually have bids in. BRT station modifications is all set to go. So completion for that is aimed to be spring 2025. That should be, if it's not already, it should be starting actually soon. Installation of Philip 50 shelters, winter 2024 will be complete. BRT Western Extension, NEPA station locations all the way up to 30% design is expected 9 months from now. And then North-South BRT NEPA station location is expected to be ended by summer. All right, jumping to more of a 10-year perspective. So the transit strategic plan was a requirement of the state and was completed, and you guys signed off in July. This is kind of just a image summary of it, but I'm just going to highlight some of the routes that are in here. This is a 10-year plus out year perspective. On the left, you see a bunch of routes. You see the Route 92. 92 is a Parham connector, so it went from Brook Road, potentially Green Cities area, all the way to Regency. You have the North-South BRT is in there. You have the extension to Parham in there as well. You have an airport express route. So lots and lots of priorities identified for planning and study purposes in existence. On the right, you have even a more robust micro transit network. So you have the ones that are already in place that are the hash lines, and then you have the planned micro transit that are being refined within the city. And then 10-year from the capital priorities perspective, we have just continuing bus replacement and expansion. Expansion, of course, when the North-South and the Western come on, we're looking at somewhere around 20 articulated buses needed to make those work. Continuing the bus stop amenities to get us to 75%, and keeping that going as we expand the system. We are making it a fleet storage lot for now, but there are plans to make it a full facility / TOD development in the future. So we want to do engineering for that. North-South BRT hopefully will be online. Western will be online with the park and ride and transfer station. Permanent downtown transfer station hopefully will be online in 10 years. North-South transfer station, started conversations on that. We've kind of outgrown this maintenance facility, especially for getting more vehicles. So having conversations of where would that be. Want to take it away from this facility since we'll have a lot more stuff going on, kind of the northern Henrico area. And then Southside transfer station, looking at the parcel we own, but as in 10 years, it'd be great to have a conversation hopefully with closer to the whole street area.
Question. Amenities above and beyond shelters, what are you calling amenities? Restrooms, or what is it we're talking about when we say amenities?
In this particular bullet, I just mean shelters and benches. But as we do, and that is a good point, that is something we are continuing to explore and to control at this point in our transfer station. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Scudder to assist him.
Adrian. Morning, everyone.
Morning.
So Adrian gave you a short overview of a number of things that are in your 10-year strategic plan, which you all adopted in July. And number one, want to just quick overview of those things. There's some substantial expansions of service over that 10-year timeframe in your strategic plan. That Airport Express service from downtown, some of these you've already implemented. The Ashland Microtransit Zone, there's a number of other microtransit zones included in that 10-year strategic plan. There's extensions of service farther out into Chesterfield to Westchester Commons. There's the extension of the Pulse all the way to Short Pump. There's a quite a substantial level of investment in new service over the 10-year timeframe. Show of hands, how many of you read into the details of the financials in the transit strategic plan? That's what I expected. So, looking from where you are today in fiscal year 2025, you're running about 550,000 revenue hours of service. Revenue hour of service is 1 hour of a bus running on the street. 1 hour of a bus running on the street costs you in the range of $140 to $150 per hour. And all in the cost of the labor to run the service, the maintenance staff, the dispatch staff, and all the administrative overhead. That 10-year strategic plan, all of the things in that strategic plan would add 61% more hours of service on the street, which would be fantastic in many ways. That would provide substantial new service to lots more people, lots more access to jobs, a lot more frequency of service, making it easier for people to get places. It also obviously would cost a good bit more to operate if you're running 61% more service. So that would take you up to just a little under 1 million hours of service per year, which would be great in many respects. It would cost a good deal. So we wanted to take you through what's the actual cost for perhaps a more limited set of expansions, just to give you the scenario of what that looks like. So starting from all of the things you did in 2025, which is actually quite a lot. Frequent service on the 7 that you're doing, the extensions of Route 1 and 1A, the frequency improvement on the 19, all of the microtransit zones. That was actually almost 40,000 revenue hours of service, I believe, just this fiscal year in expansion. And add on top of that, just things like the Western Pulse extension, the shorter term extension to Paramount, the North-South Pulse BRT, and the Route 92, the Paramount Orbital that Adrian was just talking about. That more limited expansion is just 27% more service hours or revenue hours of service over what you're doing this year. So not quite 61%. Much of that from the TSP is programmed to happen around 2029 to 2030. When it actually happens, of course, highly contingent on a lot of factors. The North-South BRT obviously takes a lot of significant capital investment. If you were at the public meeting last night and saw the plans, bus lane shelters, that takes a while to build out. So when that actually happens, could be 2031, but just for the sake of argument, let's imagine a lot of that starts to happen in 2029. That's the program for the TSP timing. Now, I've been talking in service hours. One of the challenges every transit agency faces is that most of your costs are labor, and labor costs tend to go up over time. And so even if you did no expansion of service whatsoever, the purple bars here are just the baseline that you're running today. In dollar terms, based on the typical guidelines from the state, we would expect over the next 10 years, it would cost in dollar terms about 43% more by 2034 to operate just what you're running today. So that would take you up to about $121 million in operations versus today being at about $90 million, 93. That expansion of service that I talked about adds about 20% more on top of that by 2034 to about $140 million operating budget in 2034 if you implemented just that limited set of expanded service I talked about. Now, here's where the math gets challenging. What are your revenues? This chart's a little bit complicated, so I want to be very, very detailed and careful here. So this chart is giving you the buildup of your potential revenues and the revenues that we're very confident in. So at the bottom of the chart, we're starting with the state and federal operating formula funds. The things that are formula grants based on state and federal law that you will get unless state and feds make really big changes in their policy and their budgets. So we feel pretty confident in this. Congress doesn't always change its mind, but right now we feel pretty confident in how that will go. So dark gray at the bottom, state operating formula grants. The lighter gray is the federal money that you can use for operating. Then in the little black slice is actually the special federal COVID funding that you're still using to help fund operations. That was money that was provided during COVID to help support operations. Lots of agencies at your side got more money than they could really spend in the depths of COVID. And so you've been drawing that down over time. And we anticipate you will expend the last of that in fiscal year 2027.
Does seem to go way up in 2026 and 27.
Yes, it does. That's intentional to cover the gap. Now, you have a small slice in light green there, which is some special state grants. You've got some special state grants, which are helping to fund the extension of the 1A into Chesterfield grant, for example. You have some other special state grants helping you cover some of the microtransit services. Those have, in many cases, only a 1 to 3 year lifespan. So you see that slice of the bar start to go away. So these are the ones we know you have, they're programmed, they're there. You could potentially get additional state grants in the future, but as you can see, it's a fairly small slice of that bar. It's never going to be a really big slice of the bar, no matter what, because there's a fairly limited pot. It's usually competitive, and it's usually not an extremely large amount in your overall operating budget at the end of the day. That kind of medium blue, that is your CVTA money that's going to operate service. So a sizable chunk of your budget. And then the red slice at the very top there, you have local contributions and then some additional operating from advertising, from RideFinder, van pool revenue, and so on. Pretty small slice at the top. Those two lines, the green line is the cost of operating just what you're running today. And then the blue line is above that is what if you add in some expansion. So if you continue to expand service as programmed in your TSP, that starts to obviously add over and above what you're running today to your operating cost. And you see there's a small gap in 2025 that's actually filled in with some extra grant funding and a few other things. You're pretty well on par for fiscal year 2026. For 2027, there's a bit of a gap. If we spread this further and further out, you start to see that gap start to widen significantly. And it really starts to open up in 2028 when the federal COVID funding runs out and continues to, have a sizable gap beyond that. So if we look at what does that look like in actual dollar terms, that gap in 2028 is about, with no expansion, about 12. In 2028, that gap is about $12.4 million. So if you had no additional funding from any other sources beyond this, you'd be about $12.4 million short if you did no additional expansion beyond what you're doing in this fiscal year. If you were to invest in some of the expansions that I've discussed, like the Route 92, like starting to extend the Pulse, you're facing about a $17.9 million gap in fiscal year 2028. Going onward, particularly to 29 and 30, that gap starts to really open up, particularly if you do those big expansions like the North-South BRT, which has a substantial new operating investment. And by 2034, between the effects of inflation and the effects of the expansion of service, you would have about a $35 million gap if you did affect that expansion of those major items I talked about. If you did nothing else, you'd be facing about a $17.3 million gap between your primary revenues and costs.
I lost this somewhere in here, but
yeah.
How are you treating inflation throughout this chart? Are you putting a standard inflation on the costs?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did you do that same inflation on the local share, local
yes.
contributions?
Well, the local contributions are forecasted out. Yes, on a approximately 3% basis. Now we know, I mean, and costs are also forecasted out at about a 3 to 4% basis based on the state guidelines. Obviously, we know inflation any given year is unknown. The last few, this year it's gotten a little bit back to normal trend line. The year before that was obviously way above trend line. There's no way to know for sure where that's going to go.
It just doesn't look like the local contributions are changing at all from 26 forward.
They aren't growing very dramatically, no, because they're starting from a fairly small base. And all of it, your other revenues tend to grow, they're just a much larger slice at the end of the day.
I do want to add, this does include the zero fare gap, so we're assuming there's
Mm-hmm.
no speed limit.
Yeah.
If you expand, won't you have more money coming in from the federal government?
Potentially, but it's always hard to predict in part because the formulas for federal funding are mostly weighted towards how much population is in the urbanized area of the region. There's only a small slice of that federal funding formula that's based on your ridership and your amount of service. So the vast majority of that formula is pretty well fixed to the size and population. And about 5 to 10% is weighted based on how much service you run. So yes, you expand, you get a little bit more, and the ridership follow. So if you get more riders, you get a little bit more, but it's a pretty tiny difference relative speaking. And the other challenging factor is that slice you get is also dependent on how other agency situations change. If other agencies have a big ridership increase, their piece of the pie grows, your piece might shrink. So it's not a guarantee.
So if the operating contributions are growing 4%, you're playing in the model, we have wages growing about 4% per year. And as we expand, about 2/3 of our operating costs is human capital. So as we expand, the majority of the expenses for expanding is human capital. So we're increasing the operating contributions at 3%. We're increasing labor wage rate 4%, benefits at 6%, and we're adding more labor and more benefits on top. So that's how we're getting a further exponential differential.
Let me actually back up and make sure this middle red bar is that minimum required contribution per the CBTA legislation. That top darker red slice is the small amount of extra money that you get from things like advertising, RideFinders, and so on.
So again, assumptions here are that local contributions would not increase as we do expansion, which is not something we've really discussed heavily. But
right,
the model there is predicated on the CBTA legislation where it established the minimum.
Yeah. But my point is like, so, but that is a kind of a variable behind the scenes is whether local share increases as we expand, right? Not to fund the current system, but to expand the system.
Yeah.
And you're right into the questions we want to talk about.
We're good, yep.
So we set the table.
Let's jump to conclusions.
Yeah. Allison?
I just, friends of mine are in Columbus, Ohio, and I think they're adding 5 more BRT routes in like the next year or two. And so I'm just curious, how are other jurisdictions handling this exact type of expansion planning? You know, what is required to think forward in regards to how to adjust this gap? But more importantly, how do we collaborate together as a region to really understand how to do that? And probably setting the table for one.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask that too. We're not unique in going through this. And what are other peer cities doing in regards to this gap?
Yeah, a lot of other metro areas are facing this challenge, and part of the challenge. The question: why doesn't CBTA fix this gap? You built the CBTA funding to help you expand, right? One of the challenges you face, and a lot of agencies face, is for CBTA, that whole structure was really built out in 2019, 2020, and in the meantime, GRTC's cost structure has changed dramatically. Operator pay has increased by about 35%. Health insurance costs have increased by about 61%. And Those wages and benefits represent about 64% of your operating costs. So that inflationary challenge that everyone has faced has been particularly hard on human service focused and operations focused businesses like GRTC, like transit agencies in general. What are other regions looking at? Other regions are looking at expansions of investment in various ways to help continue to expand their services. Columbus has had a dedicated funding source for a number of years. I'm not precisely sure the details of their financing, so I can't tell you exactly what they're doing at this particular moment. But yes, a number of other regions are, the DMV is now looking at they pulled together a huge regional coalition to start thinking about what can they do, because WMATA is facing similar challenges in this regard.
Actually. Yes. Yeah.
That comparison, right?
Yeah.
Go back to one so, kind of to Lincoln's point, I will say the legislation looking at the fiscal year 2020 was not really looking at, I guess, expansion in the way that it's set with percent reduction does not require a 50% contribution as you expand. I think the expectation in conversations was that we cover making service, but we also have $10 million to go for expansion. And looking at this, was looking at inflation. $10 million is not something that's sustainable. We tried to introduce kind of early on. At this point, we've got a lot of grants to basically not spend any of the CDTA dollars coming on maintenance and service. So looking at what Steve described here, a lot of that money, even in terms of the expansion that we kept putting aside, is just being eaten by the fact that we had to pay operators a lot more, which was not something that was considered.
Can I just say that I was in the conversation at the time around PTA, and funding expansion, I will not say was like the primary goal, part of the purposes were regional participation in funding, and to remove some of the uncertainty around transit funding when it was contingent on the local contributions and it was budget fighting conversation, get a dedicated revenue source for GRTC outside of local municipal budgets. Which is why I think some of the conversations around expansion are, like the right way to expand and the right cost share formula, whatever we want to call it, is part of the work we have in front of us. And
I'd say we weren't ready yet. We had established the source.
Yeah. Which I'm just going to jump to a point here, which is like when CBTA was created, 15% was dedicated to transit. It was part of the negotiation amongst the region was created, more dedicated revenues for GRTC than it ever existed because there had been none. But there's tools that even other authorities in Virginia are using to fund transit that we did not ask for at the time because we were early, and I think we've really got to talk about them in the context of how we support expansion going forward. I mean, it would be now that we're building towards a place where we're not just saying we want to grow, but we know how we want to grow, using general terms. And we are kind of, we'll call it, we have a stable operating budget, despite the presentation. But we can stably fund what we're doing today. But if we want to expand, I think that's an opportunity to go back and ask for some of the tools that we didn't ask for in the first appeal for CBTA, like ride share, taxation, et cetera. And that's just something we got to talk about because we can talk about how we fund this by either the payers are either going to be the riders, the localities, or the region through something like CBTA.
So yeah, I mean, ultimately what we're trying to do is just set the groundwork for you all to think about what is it you want to do to try to make these things happen. Seems like everyone is bought in on making these expansions happen. So just a little more background, at least on this financial scenario that we've constructed. Again, this is a scenario built around the priority things people talk about in terms of expansion. What are the CBTA funding? What's the CBTA funding going to in this scenario we've constructed? Most of it is being spent on running service, maintaining existing service, and starting in 2026, in this scenario, you're actually spending more than you're getting in every year. Part of that is because of the COVID funding and other things, you haven't had to use a lot of that CBTA money. So you've got almost a $15 million reserve at the moment. In this scenario, we have constructed for your consideration and just overall thinking today, we've constructed a scenario that starts to draw some of that down, but not draw it down extremely quickly. In order, in part, to keep some of a reserve there for you as flexibility in your capital plan and so on. So this scenario has been constructed to put about 2.7 million a year set aside for capital. That would fund about 5%, which is 4 to 5% is your typical match you need between federal and state funding for your kind of basic capital needs every year. Your basic capital needs are about $50 to $55 million a year for fleet replacement and all of the kind of basics that you need. That doesn't fund major capital projects like South BRT or Downtown Transit Center or other big things, but that we felt like that was a reasonable scenario to say CVTA is here to help fund the entire system and the whole region system. So that set aside is there as the sort of fundamental capital need across the network. The blue on the left is the revenue coming into GRTC. The orange bar is how much total is being spent each year. And you see in 26, 27, 28, 29, you're spending more than you're actually getting in. The purple line is that reserve that's coming down in part because you're spending more. And green is how much is being spent on operating, and then the light blue is how much is being spent on capital. That capital, as I said, about 2.7 million, growing with inflation over time. The operating costs, of course, and the revenues all being assumed to inflate forward.
Scudder, on the capital side, are you assuming that for major expansion like BRT that that's tapping into the other 35% CPA regional for that match piece?
We haven't made any assumptions about where you get the capital funding for those major projects at this point. They're just, at this moment, we don't know. You would have to, as a board and as a region, figure out where you tap those funds.
Curious about the state General Assembly in regards to infrastructure costs, street costs, road maintenance, especially routes regionally. It's now not just a city limits thing, which it has been previously for many decades. I'm just curious what we could think about how they're supporting of this, especially as it relates to infrastructure costs on their end, because the county's funding for infrastructure for street maintenance is different than the cities. And just thinking about how we're looking at really creating this expansion of routes across the region, there being a partner in some of those costs could help offset some of the things we could support in this capacity too. Just curious how infrastructure funding supports this just beyond operating buses.
So the focus of this sort of scenario is really on the long-term operations of the system, not so much on the capital investment. In terms of what the General Assembly may be willing to do long-term and adjusting funding, I'm not sure.
I just think I was just trying to add it to the conversation because those are going to be extra costs we have to take on to support sidewalks, the connectivity, all the pieces that make the transit bus stops and expansion work. And if we're not including that in our planning, then it's going to be a struggle for move forward too.
That's a bigger conversation with the TPO, the localities, and with the state.
I'm fully aware, so I'll make sure I raise it here.
Yeah. So just a really quick note, a little more. That purple line again is the same line as before, showing in this scenario how that reserve is being somewhat spent down, but also keeping some there for flexibility in your capital program. Some of it could perhaps go to some small part of major capital projects, but also the orange line is showing you what is a kind of 2-month reserve of your total operating cost as a way of thinking about you need to keep a certain amount of money in the bank for flexibility purposes and what might be a minimum that you want to not go below in terms of a reserve from that CBTA account. You don't quite reach that in this scenario. So again, the scenario, we could adjust those a little bit maybe, but still you're spending and you eventually need to a point where you're not spending it down in the long term. Now, that whole scenario I just talked about actually assumes that you get some additional local funding to the table in order to fill that gap. What I just showed you. What happens if you don't get any additional local funding?
It's terrible.
You could use your CBTA reserve to help backfill for the short term, no additional local funding. But by 2030, you exhaust that reserve in its entirety. And by 2031, you would find you still obviously have a gap. Now that gap is 34 million, and everyone would suddenly have to figure out how to fill that. This scenario is built around the idea that there is additional local funding that starts to roll out slowly over time. This is no one's bringing more money to the table in the short term, and that gap hits immediately after you exhaust CBTA funding in 2030. So there are, again, some other opportunities like state funding to help fill some of that gap. I think Adrian has some additional details here, but demo grants, which you've already started to use for some of your expansions, the limitation challenge there, and they disappear, and then you've got to start funding the operations the next year. There's your trip grants. You're already using a trip grant to help fund your zero fare. That's slowly rolling away and will disappear. There may be opportunities. Adrian, you want to speak to this for more trip funding?
Yeah, even the first one, I mean, I've talked to some of you, like the things that are demo grants this year, we plan on applying for trip grants next year. So strategic ways to kind of keep pushing that reserve down the line. Exhausted, we will be trying all those. We just know that they're not necessarily going to happen, guaranteed. So that will happen. And if we need more expansion, of course, we'll be going after them. So next is zero fare. I mentioned that is also in that gap. We are happy to say that we now have Rachel. She is our transit advertising specialist, and she's kind of around learning on bringing bus wraps. We have a ordinance going before council for expanding to shelters, benches, and everything in the right of way, so that we can not just do buses, but actually have shelters and benches to be able to do advertising. And then we're going to aggressively try and get our pulse line sponsored this year. So we're hoping to be able to bring revenue in with that to cover a significant gap. And then I'd have a conversation with GRTC on Friday. The way the trip grant, you only can apply once. However, there is an ability for another agency to apply for the funds and have it go towards GRTC. So we are going to work with the TPO to be able to apply for trip this next time around. And that just kind of follows conversations that we have continuously been having recently, but also over the last 1 to 2 years, about just the region's perspective on zero fare from a funding perspective from the private sector. We are going to continue to aggressively build on that. A lot of it is education. So I'm going to work on that over the next few years, but working on it with both Plan RVA, TPO, and the chamber. We need a little bit more time. So if we're able to get this, that will give us more time to get to the point of getting community support. But with that, hopefully we'll be successful at that. That's another vehicle that we've identified that could give us a little bit more funding to go to that. And then there's, of course, some strategic operating grants we could go after. That would be more about accessibility, congestion mitigation, that wouldn't be specifically for zero fare, but could help offset it. So we are not just waiting around, we're trying to get as much funding as we can to kind of keep pushing that also with revenue sources coming in. Restating that we have the advertising and partnership program for zero fare.
And the trip is just, you can do it twice, like the agency and then the MPO. Can you do it 3 times?
So it's either TPO or CTA.
Oh. Okay.
So technically, yes.
We could do it.
But I don't know if you could keep pushing that down the line. GRTC has to support it, and it has to be approved by CTV. So
I was wondering if the locality could be one of the.
that was my first question, actually. I was going to start with each jurisdiction, but they said only those 2 entities have the ability to apply for trip opposed to, but you applied for trip. So that's why I was wondering that as well. So that's what they told me on Friday. Okay. But
I think if you use a lot of different avenues to try to get from the same pot, eventually they borrow from your parents. They're going to sort of say, okay, we're done. So again, big picture, of course, that green bar, that green bar in the middle I showed before, is you're doing pretty well in state operating grant support and special grants like these. So, that could be 5-8% like it is now in the future, but it's highly uncertain and it's not going to quite fill that full gap that we're talking about, but it's still an important part. Yes.
Just want to make sure I say this out loud because I get asked this question all the time about fare free. Is I would hate to get to a future place in 4 to 5 years where we're making decisions on this and fare free is seen as the way to make up the difference, or getting rid of it, adding fares back in, whatever that could look like, because that is something I think we need to think about more broadly on in regards to free flowing of people around the region. Specifically, when we think about bigger events, bigger things that are going on the weekends, I know when you think about lines for big like sporting events in cities or big concerts, et cetera, the queuing just to get to transit to make sure you don't have to park when you get there or leave on the way out, and just how much that creates a backlog and or make people use an alternative, which will be driving, and thinking about other ways in which we don't get down a path where that's being jeopardized or being thought of just because of money. And I'm trying to make sure we think about how we're intentionally planning for transit access regionally, because that could be an opportunity where things get tight, or we're like, well, we can make up that difference, we put fares back. Just want to make sure we have that conversation as we think forward, because that is something I could see a future board, because this is only us for the next couple of years, changing. So I just want to make sure I kind of said that out loud too. That is a really unique part of Richmond's opportunity right now, and how do we keep that?
I would say keeping the zero fares and having conversations with how it's beneficial.
Correct, because I think if we get to a place where things get tight as we expand and grow, we don't know economically what's going to happen in the future. And so just concerned about that being sacrificed or lost, and then therefore changing how our ridership looks at our transit system.
And I think that's part of the conversation with the chamber and RPA, and I would say as you guys as champions, that this going to other cities is kind of, we said, like the intercity trips and all of that. You see that when you come back here, and the perspective is not the same here. So over the next 3 to 5 years, how do we educate that transit is a push towards economic development, TOD, bringing in more revenue, bringing in additional revenue as far as the tax works. That's not something that you do just typically get your car and ride.
Now, obviously, this is not a financial problem that's occurring right now. This is a challenge that's going to appear over the next few years. So the intention today is really start the conversation, start laying out possibly some big picture policies to follow as a board, as an agency, as you go through this process. And just to clarify the direction you all as a board would like to go. As staff continues to model financial scenarios for what to do, and you all as a board take these conversations back to your localities, to TPO and others. So there's a couple of policy questions we want to talk through today regarding how you use the CVTA funding and what kind of reserve you may want to keep. Options and possibilities to start thinking about to fill that gap over the long term. And then your priorities for some of these capital projects, because you obviously can't go after all of them at the same time. And we're going to need to sequence these. So we have a poll here. Now I might have to ask for some assistance with this poll. This is not my software. It started. There we go. So one of the assumptions that we've made in this scenario that we've constructed for you is that we're spreading CVTA funding effectively across all services across the entire network. So CVTA funding is going to support that kind of baseline capital program you need to keep the whole system running over the long term in terms of fleet replacement. And the operating funding is going as a support across all services in the network, irrespective of where they are, what they do, and how they serve. So should we continue to look at those CVTA dollars as a funding pot that goes equally to all services across the network, across the region, no matter where they are? An alternative would be to, for example, WMATA in the DC region has different funding formulas for different bus routes, depending on whether they're a regionally designated route that goes between different jurisdictions, or it's a route that's mostly in one jurisdiction. which is some things we've talked about in the past with some of you as a possibility, but does start to create a lot of complexity in how you plan, fund, and manage and operate your transit network. So the big picture question then, and most of you have already answered this, should we continue to treat it as a support for all services across the network?
A question of clarification. You're talking about the dedicated 15%.
Yes, the dedicated 15% that's going to GRTC. Yeah. Obviously, the other funding that's managed by CBTA is managed separately.
In other words, we get 33 million operating budget, 93, all 30 million to support our operating budget, not necessarily a certain amount goes to Rhinebeck, a certain amount goes to the city. Just.
Are you just taking information?
We were talking about this, so does anyone want to speak up for either position strongly?
I'm the least connected to any government agency in this board. And one of the simplest reasons for my yes was the letter CD. When we start talking about it as a regional pod, it seems more defendable to take the role of saying, yes, we continue to do that, you know, sort of blind to the specific nuance of these different areas. That was what was easy for me to say.
Makes sense. I understand that one.
Other thoughts around the room?
I was thinking that there, maybe it works that way, but at the same time, should be defendable that the CVTA dollars are supporting more regional type of transit lines. And not necessarily accounting for every dollar, but justifying that the CVTA regional dollars are going to regional.
So you would be thinking about it in terms of perhaps there's a separation between some services that are wholly within one locality would perhaps not get CVTA funding? Is that what
Right.
you're perhaps thinking?
Right. And maybe not more of a justification showing that the CVTA.
That there's some regional nexus?
Yes.
So Barbara, would that include the microtransit that would be fully dedicated in a?
I would think microtransit would be a local.
From a DA standpoint, would be a tougher conversation when we're talking in Powhatan or Eugene or Hanover. That what they're paying is helping.
But they can't. Right. So some sort of participation, determining how much they're contributing. If the cost of service is exceeding their contribution.
I think that's, I think it's a fundamental point. It's like, I think if, just like any other thing, behavior, you're not paying anything for it, how much do you value it? And if there's skin in the game, so to speak, between the locality and GRTC, this board, CBTA, and there is a share, I think it's a calculation we haven't done yet because of how we got to where we are with local funding and what does it mean for going forward.
Right. Yeah.
I think CBTA, which has multiple jurisdictions that aren't really outside of microtransit, aren't served by the system, are going to revolt if you don't have something in there that services their area without their contribution. But to your point, if you can calculate what they're putting in and what that cost is, then that's a different story.
But on the backside of this, let's fast forward a few years. In any business, if the funding is not there, if there is a gap down the road, as decisions are being made about, okay, now we need to make some tough choices. What happens if we haven't produced a well-run full machine? The areas that stand to do the best in the future, the Powhatans, the ones that are on the periphery that can grow with a robust unity, will be the first ones on the chopping block. That's my guess. We'll be forced to look into metrics of ridership, cost per bus, whatever, and then those will likely be. That's a what-if scenario. If there's a gap down the road, hard choices have to be made. That's just my thinking. That it's likely to happen.
Yeah, I guess I think the more local, there needs to be some sort of participation by locality to support something that's owned.
So like, I don't disagree, but it's just a way it was asked.
Yeah. Any other thoughts around the room on this? Okay. So this is perhaps an easier question. We projected in that scenario the possibility of setting aside a certain minimum reserve that you keep of CBTA funding for flexibility in your capital plan and as a backstop. Start.
Why is this question specifically related to CBTA funding and not the overall reserve?
We already have a policy, the board adopted a policy for our regular.
Which is what? Of annual?
So the question would be, in addition to that 25%, should there be an additional reserve just of CBTA funds?
25% of annual is 3 months.
Right.
Look at it that way, right?
Yeah, that's 3 months. So should there be some minimum reserve amount of CBTA funding separate from that? For example, for maintaining some flexibility in the capital program and so on. Should it be 1 month, 2 months, 3 months?
So you already have 3.
Of operating.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, separate, and you have 3 as a separate matter today.
And are we still doing we're spending last year's CBTA collections in this fiscal year?
Any other thoughts or questions with respect to this?
I think the localities, I mean, we can share our opinions, but the localities have a say in what they're going to give, right?
Well, in terms of potential local funding, this is separate. This is a separate question.
I understand CVTA funding, I'm on the board, but what I'm saying is we as a board can speak to what we would like, but ultimately, I mean, each locality is going to
Figure out what their budget is.
Yeah, they're going to do what they see best too. What they see is best for the support and not just of GRTC, but transit in general. So we can share, we can share our opinions. I mean, it may be that we probably need to pull some folk together on this board and talk about some of it. Maybe like a little subcommittee or something.
This assumption incorporated, I imagine, into the regional public transportation planning. Because that's how we funded it. This is saying Scudder is presented as we have drawn down CBTA funds that are sitting in CBTA bank account. How much do we go down to? So that would be a component.
Ultimately goes to CVTA.
Process.
I think that Reverend else was saying,
Right.
they have to get together to discuss how to make it sustainable.
Just for the record, I didn't answer that last one. You can add the numbers up because you didn't give me a choice above 3.
What?
Give me
More than 3?
You can give me an option. So
Okay.
you add those numbers up, there's a vote missing.
Gotcha. Okay. So alternatives to think about in terms of filling that gap as you potentially experience your revenues falling short of costs, and particularly as you think about that gap getting bigger if you want to expand. So one alternative is to effectively ask, as Nelson was suggesting, effectively you have to ask in this respect, asking localities to come to the table with additional funding. And one avenue for doing that, if you're treating CVTA dollars, for example, as a regional pot that's going to all services, no matter where they are, once you've spread that, once you've spread your state and federal dollars in a similar fashion, you could effectively go to localities and say, okay, the gap now is 10% of our budget. You need to help fund 10% of the service in your jurisdiction. That's one approach you could take. This is a pie chart of your service this year, fiscal year 2025. How much of your service in terms of revenue hour terms is in each jurisdiction? So this gives you a sense then, if you were to go to all of the localities and say, you need to put up 10% of the operating budget in order to fill the gap, how that would fall across the various jurisdictions in the region based on where service is today, if that's the approach you took.
Clearly, go ahead. Clearly knowing Goochland, Powhatan, and Hanover are gonna hang up the phone. Right? Clearly knowing that 3 of those are gonna hang the phone up, so that 4% has to be absorbed. Clearly, we know that. So what you're saying is if there's a 10% gap, that, or let's say 4%, 1.33, you would go to Richmond and say you owe 62.33% of that 10%. Henrico, you owe 27.33% of that 10%. And Chesterfield, you owe 10.33% of that 20%. And that's how the gap is funded every year. There's your special assessment
Ashland,
on the gap.
it says, or Ashland might actually, I don't know if they can put in 2%, but Ashland might actually contribute something.
More the better.
Because
That's the point.
the other ones will.
There's 10% missing of 100 million. There's 10 million missing, and 6.233 million would come from Richmond as a special assessment to fill the gap.
Yeah, the ask, you can call it special assessment, you can call it.
But a wrinkle to what Dan is saying is, and I know this would be, Richmond and Henrico are really the only 2 localities under that state mandated percent minimum based on where we were before.
Chesterfield a little bit.
Dan, how are you arriving at the 66%? Help me understand that.
He's giving it to us.
2.33, and the reason is there's 4% of county jurisdictions that I just didn't think would answer that phone when we went back to them for this, I'll call it a special assessment of gap funding. And then what is being presented here is that 61%, is that 50, that's 61, right?
Yes.
61% of revenue hours are currently being used in Richmond. So the presentation is saying that Richmond would then owe 62.33%, Henrico would owe 27.33%, and Chesterfield would owe 10.33%. That would cover the full nut. And I mean, if you're asking my opinion, Ellen, I was asking that question just to make it really clear that I don't think that's a viable option. But that's what's being presented as a possible solution on how to fill the gap alternative. I think that's how I'm reading it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the spread it across based on where services.
So this would be breaking up by the gap because we already have the funding. So if the gap is what, 17.5 million in a couple of years?
Yeah.
This is how we would disperse.
One possibility for, yeah.
So the question would be, given that this pie chart is based upon current routes, and we're also talking about the next 10 years of routes, how would it shift? Because we can't do that expansion without investing in that today. So this
yellow would increase. Yeah, it would increase. Yeah.
Thinking about how this would possibly shift in the next 10 years, that is something I think has to be applied here too.
We can give you the numbers. They change a little bit. The pie doesn't change dramatically. It's, closer to maybe 55 to 60% city, maybe around, closer to 30% in Riker, maybe, it shifts a bit, but it doesn't completely change.
So I think Richmond is going to, with the master plan, focus on more transit-oriented development, which is going to be density around key corridors. And so we're going to have more ridership because we're designing for more ridership. Like we're intentionally creating that connectivity. So we want to see that number be a big part because we're growing because of this access this provides to the city and the region. So there is a reason why this is key for that. That's why connecting this with economic development is such an important piece because that's where first floor retail thrives, is around strategic bus stops and connections between bus routes. And that's what I think we need to also elevate in terms of what we do moving forward as well.
I will say that a shift in our, if you look at this pie chart last year, the city of Richmond would be 2%.
Correct.
Quick question on assumptions of how far you're diving down into this. So for example, express service. Express service from Gaskins to downtown. All those revenue hours equated to Henrico because it starts in Henrico.
I think for this level of analysis,
Exactly the question we were just discussing. So who would answer? That's a great question.
So right now this pie chart is split.
He would say
is taking a route and splitting it geographically, the length of the line, what percentage of the line is in each jurisdiction, and multiplying it. So you can go in and you can fine grain assess and say, okay, really maybe 20% of that is really for Henrico, or 20%. You can get to a fine grain level about what you think is the right split for each individual route. Express routes aren't going to change the map a lot, but yeah, you could do that.
Well, it's the same with microtransit zones, right? You have zones that cross over borders, how you're getting, you're really need to blur the lines with respect to what transit doing for the weekend. Dividing a line, this is on this side, this on that side. It's very inaccurate.
I would concur. I just said that. That is.
As much as I want to
contrary.
protect Chesterfield in my position, if the city wasn't in the middle with all of the stuff in the middle, the rest of it wouldn't exist. So, I mean,
It's contrary to our collective goals. It's contrary to why we created the board the way it is now, which I am thrilled with. It's contrary to what CVTA is about. It's contrary to how we serve our constituents. It's contrary to someone who lives in one jurisdiction and works in a.
That's kind of.
It draws a bolder differentiation on a county or city line, and that is not what I'm trying to do. So I'm not a fan.
Okay.
I guess we're going back to what would be, not the station, but what would be the percent? What would be a methodology for the percent?
You're assuming that there's a percent split, right? Like the CVTA collects the tax dollars with no respect to lines, right on. If somebody gets gas and then crosses the county line, it still goes in the same bucket. So like, I guess the assumption there is that there's a split, and I didn't vote on the first question either. Like I didn't vote on the first one either, where you asked if CVTA funding should go to fill all, because it depends wasn't an option, or portion wasn't an option. It was either yes, no. And I don't think it was yes, no answer.
I don't think we're going to be able to solve this. And
they're asking us to solve. I think they're asking us to be aware of it.
But I think it's definitely set up for a discussion that's going to have to take place that is necessary. I mean, basically, it's opening our eyes to.
Sure.
We focused honestly to how do we stay fare free as long as we can, which we said was probably at least through 2027. We're kind of hearing that's correct, but. And now it's time to start preparing for the future beyond that. And that's going to be a lot more difficult conversation.
Because the math question has become a philosophical question.
That's right.
Yeah. This has been ever since CVTA and the transit funding, back of my mind as a huge puzzle to figure out. I've talked to Adrian about it. Figure out how we're going to deal with expansion. How's that going to work?
I don't see.
So one other, sorry.
One question, is the gap that we are looking at, what's created, is the expansion, how much impact does expansion have on the gap?
The expansion grows the gap, but the gap appears after about 2027, no matter what, due to just general cost inflation. So even if you didn't expand, you'd still be facing a gap.
It's my notes right here at the end. I'm sure we'll have a chance to comment. We knew that. We've been discussing it in Finance Committee. This is not new. I'm not a huge fan of the scary picture that's being painted today, because it's not. And I have all my notes. I'll share it at the appropriate time. I'm gonna let them finish.
So another approach, and again, these are just possibilities to think about, is if you start to apply the cost of expanded service to the jurisdictions where that service runs, and effectively the ask being, if we're doing something new, we're going to ask you to take on some or all of the cost of that new thing, and keep the cost of what we're doing now effectively covered based on CVTA funding, federal funding, and all the other approaches. If we look at the cost of North-South BRT, the Western BRT extension in Route 92, for example, that requires about the cost of that alone is about $21.7 million in 2030. That funding gap I showed you in 2030 is about 27 million. So it's not quite all of that gap between revenues and costs, but it's a sizable portion. So if you were to try to distribute that across the three major jurisdictions where that service would run by 2030, this is assuming the fuller build out of BRT. that would break down approximately like this. Be asking for an additional $4 million from Chesterfield, an additional $10 million from Henrico, an additional $7 million from Richmond because there's not enough to pay for that expansion. And so you'd effectively be saying, we want to do more. We're not going to ask you to pay more for what you have now, but we're going to ask you to pay more for the new things. That's another approach to trying to solve some of this, is to say pay for the new or pay for the additional.
So this chart would help if you saw what they already contribute as well.
Mm-hmm.
It would show it would be very helpful to know what are these jurisdictions each contributing currently to be asked for on top of, so we understand. Okay. Okay, sorry. I'd rather see that one than the previous one. Gotcha.
Talk about it in finance all the time. I mean, that's set. That's the one that moves on.
That's the minimum CVTA required.
Correct. And it moves on CPI every.
Oh, but go back. Yeah. So go back to the previous one. Okay. So if you were to take that the right side chart and add it to the other side, 3, 10, 7.
That is what this is. This is.
I just don't see this number. Sorry. 3, 7, 12.
So this is still the minimum CVTA contract.
You already added it into it. Got it. Okay.
This is the total cost of operating the service as any jurisdiction. Not what you're asked for, but what's just the total cost of operating the service in 2025 plus those expanded services I just mentioned. And then this is the minimum contribution requirement per CVTA in 2025.
So another component of this goes back to the CBTA. Some jurisdictions will then figure out what percentage of contribution of revenues to the CBTA is through sales tax and gas tax, then back out that 15% on what their contribution is to CBTA, which goes back to, is that regional, is that?
So you're suggesting, if I'm understanding correctly, that the jurisdiction will try to back out what money it's contributing via CBTA funding?
It is a math exercise that has been done.
That's including the 991 on 1A extension.
Right. That includes the 1A.
So that's above the 50% threshold.
So I mean, roughly what Henrico is like 7 million, let's say, of the 50%. The amount that's proportional from Henrico.
Yeah, it's like
something like that. I would say add that to it.
Yeah, 32%, Chesterfield 29%.
That goes back to other questions being looked at as a regional
Right.
pod.
Right. So if you're thinking about the CBTA money as just a regional pod you spread across all services, then you would just skip that math.
I mean, to be honest with you, like, the city would greatly be impacted if that was the case. A lot of train system was the city historically, so that would take away from.
But I can tell you, finance departments and jurisdictions do.
I'm sure.
Do that math.
So there are many spreadsheets of that math in many finance departments.
I've done a few.
I imagine. So thinking about the two options we've talked about, contribute as a set percentage by the service amount in each jurisdiction, or contribute based on some percentage of the expanded services in each jurisdiction. Those are the two options we talk about as possibilities. Again, these are ideas to continue thinking about.
The first one I voted, I missed the whole conversation.
So
We just told Henrico's going to pay it off. We just said Henrico's going to pay it off.
should local jurisdictions contribute to help fill this gap? Yes, one of those, should it be set percentage by the service amount? Should it be, or yes, should it be a contribution based on the percentage of the expanded service? Or do you have some other idea you think we should be exploring as you consider these possibilities over the next few years? Or no, do you think localities shouldn't be asked for any additional investment? And maybe there's another possibility you have in mind as well. Think through that.
So with the contribution percentage of the state service, that's supposed to follow the theme about legislation cut it by 50%. So thinking about 10%, 30%, 50%. Any route that's added, should there be a contribution, whatever the percent might be, for the service? And I would go the 111 is a good example of that, where you guys were paying 20% already on contributions when it happened for that route. So your methodology was to continue to pay 50% of the 20% to go of 10. But
Right.
so you can say you're paying 10% of that service as an expansion.
So by saying more, you're not necessarily implying all.
Oh, no, that, they will just show you the raw numbers. That wasn't a recommendation.
This question.
To contribute, I think the idea of this question is, should you be asked, should local jurisdictions be asked in some capacity to contribute to help fill this gap? As Adrian talked about, there are opportunities through state grants, through even federal CMAQ grants and others to help fill that gap. A lot of those are going to potentially be temporary, but can help minimize what your ask might be in the first couple of years of this gap. Okay. I think we've got most everyone has voted in some way. So we've got 5 of you saying a set percentage by service amount. 1 of you suggested a percentage based on expanded service. 2 of you said no. Does anyone want to speak up for their particular vote and their thoughts?
Happy to go. I said no. I'll tell you why. 1, again, we're serving the greater whole. And if there's expansion needed in somewhere, it's because our collective residents need it. And I think this operation is running extremely well like a business. And a business would take expansion when the dollars of the operating budget and revenue support it. And that's in my notes for later, that expansion should always be planned like we are now, and it should be measured, and it should be expanded when revenue supports it, not expanded and then try to figure out how to pay for it. So that's mine. And then Mr. Nelson said something that's still stuck with me, and he's exactly right. I said no because I don't feel it's going to pass. Well, like we have 9 city council members. You have 5. We have 5. This is a lot more difficult than us just saying, sure, the local jurisdiction. He's right. This is not as easy as that. And I'd like to run a business on not a hope or a whim or I think it'll be I want to operate on what we know. And what we know is you guys are dutifully planning for expansion, and you have designs and you have plans and you have the ready. And when the revenue supports it, expand. But don't expand and then say, well, now we got to come collect to help pay for that. That is not. That's why I voted on that one. It's the first one I voted on. It's the first answer that was easy.
So I would say, so again, that's why that baseline scenario today is showing that gap in 10 years of 12 million. I mean, more, I feel like that's doable. When 8 million of that also is zero fair. So I don't think that's a concern, especially as we continue to push the CBTA further out as we do.
You're correct.
This is more about planning, as you just said. So the FY28, the reason that's there is because right now, the way that when this was done, 27 was the expectation for the month. That's probably more of 28 anyway. So all of this kind of comes slides.
Correct.
So it's planning for that now. Like the 19 will switch over in terms of some of that cost. We're still going to keep the 19. So there's still some cost, a little bit will pay for some of that, but there is an expectation that we know that we want to do the West expansion. The next huge one is the reason that it really gets dropping off in 29 and have listed north-south here. 12 miles, all pretty much in the city of Richmond. So again, expansion wasn't talked about as the part of the CBTA conversation. We know we are full force in capital grants as far as planning for this to happen. We still have 5 years, but it's not as gloomy as we show it, because those years probably will slide, but we want to have a conversation and put those online. And right now we have the 7s, the 1s, the 1A in Chesterfield, and even the 19s, so between the right and Chesterfield. Primarily, we just did expansion. We have grants for a good 3 years for those.
Correct.
We're fine, but what is that policy, I guess, conversation of when those do run out, because I can only apply for so many things so many times. We don't, the revenue is not there today, and right at this point in time, it won't be there in 3 years for just those services, which if the gap is smaller at 12 million in 10 years, including those, but it still ends up being a gap. How do we plan for that conversation? So I think we're okay for now, but it needs to, conversation needs to happen down to 2.
Dave answered it earlier with, that's when choices occur. We're making choices today on how we operate. We're making choices today. He answered it earlier and he said those days will come and those choices will be made. And we talk about it in finance all the time about planning. We talked about reserve, which is why I didn't answer the question because there wasn't a more than 3-month opportunity. $50 million in reserve. I think John will tell you we'll spit out $2 million in interest. I'm guessing a $50 million reserve can be counted on at 4%, right? So that's 1.6. That's almost, I wrote down in my notes again later, we'll get to it. I wrote down almost 2 million if you go that reserve to the point, and you had talked about 2.7 million in capital as the goal. These answers are right in front of us, but the decisions are going to be later. I know you're asking for vision now, and the vision now is, again, we'll get to it when we get a chance when you're done, but strengthen your reserves, plan for expansion, expand when the revenue is possible, but don't expand past your resources where you have to backfill gap funding.
So 5 of you suggested yes to contribute. Strong thoughts with respect to that answer.
Maybe just speaking on behalf of the city, you know, and Ms. Robertson could articulate this better than I could, but, you know, the city's relation to GRTC, longstanding, et cetera, and, you know, really historically helped get the transit company off the ground and expanding, and then we're all able to build off of it. So I do think there's a piece maybe from the city, Great Henrico's perspective, that there is, you know, we're paying a cost share, you know, so is it equitable that new localities joining the system would also pay in? That said, it's not like we don't want, I mean, we'll say this all the time, but that the expansion of the transit system into the region helps city residents because it allows them to get to job opportunities or other, or go shopping, whatever that may be. It's good for all of us when the system expands. And so if, you know, kind of saying, all right, we are where we are on local funding, instead of, you know, we'll call it the 9 of us or 10 of us that are on CBTA, you know, fighting at each other about what's fair and equitable, then we just might need to grow the regional pot and focus on that and make that the place that we fund expansion further. I think either strategy could work. One requires getting 9 different or 10 different boards to agree, which is hard. The other is maybe going to the General Assembly and getting them to agree to expand our authority.
So I think all of these are tough questions, always are when we're talking about how much revenue is needed to provide. But I think what's more important to me is that this board was created because we recognize the need for a regional transportation system. And the representation on this board should represent a significant share of our local boards, governing bodies' decision. And I do think that it's important that the weight of decisions that are made by this board to our local governments should be valued from the perspective of their representation on the board and us making decisions that creates a regional public transportation system. If we are not willing to create the regional transportation by the expansion of the routes so that we have a regional transportation, and our local participating governments aren't willing to vote to support that, as painful as it may be at times to do that, then we will not be successful in achieving a regional goal, which is the purpose of this new board that we have here to accompany that. Now, our leveraging of power and influence at the state level and others to make that happen should be just as powerful. But if all 3 or 9 or of this board, our representation, if we agree, it should have influence at a local level to recognize the value of the regional transportation that we are that we've obligated ourselves to make a reality. So how we go about funding it and what parts of funds we use and what percentages and those kind of things, I think it's been said best. Probably does need a little subgroup to kind of really come to a firm recommendation to the board. But I do want us to stay committed to this regional commitment and also influence our local governments of the significance and the importance of doing so.
Any other thoughts on this question? Again, this is background to start a conversation about, long-term situation. The other big piece of this is thinking about what are your priorities for major capital investment, major capital planning over the next 10 years. These are some of your significant capital projects from the TSP. And I think maybe Adrian can speak a little more in detail to each of them. But at this point, we want to get feedback about what are your priorities as staff needs to think about where we sequence these in terms of the grant applications. A lot of these are going to need state and federal grant application funding on competitive grants. So where would you rank these in priority as staff start to sequence these? This is the last bit. Yeah, it's actually the last question overall. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Adrian to close out. Thank you all.
I'm kind of confused about, well, hold on. All right.
Technical difficulties on the
Yeah,
question?
I'm figuring it out.
Select one. 5 goes to 1, or is it just?
I think this is the bottom right. It's not like speed votes, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
I guess I was just saying that the person's second protected the little amount.
Maybe that, because each of you ranked them in 1 to 5, correct? So it may be that the NSBRT and Guideline Transfer Center got the same average ranking, but perhaps NSBRT had more number ones. That's how the tiebreakers work in this type of question. Okay. Any questions or thoughts with respect to this priority?
I would like to qualify that I think they're all very important components of the system. So my rank was perhaps more based on timing rollout as opposed to do it or not do it.
Yeah, that's sort of the way I sort of thought about it as well, is what is more ready, easier to get done.
Mm-hmm. So what do you see as
It seems
maybe you're
like,
thinking about it in terms of shovel-ready terms, what's more shovel-ready?
yeah, like BRT Western seems to be farther along.
Western's further along. I would like to think downtown transfers easier to do, but I don't know.
I concur, and I also did it with impact. Like the downtown transfer station, the impact is going to be monumental. So like they're all important. I wouldn't want to take any of them off the list, but I did mine with impact. Like where are we going to see the biggest bang, like, and quickly? So I ranked mine.
Impact is not at all the same as shovel ready. So I'm
Correct.
not sure whether that's what you were referring to. I wasn't thinking shovel-ready when you said that. I was thinking you were talking about impact.
Well, it's a little both. I mean, north-south, obviously, huge impact, but it's not as far along as many of the other projects.
Yeah, I mean, that's my exact list right there, except for 1 and 2. I just put transfer station there because I feel like it's gonna happen before north-south BRT.
It wasn't about not being off the list, to like all number one priority at the same time, but as we apply for grants, there's requests. Apply for all of them, but also put a priority rate. They're going to compete for the same exact dollars. Our would be Western would be ready now, but North South needs to start getting money now also because it needs to be
So with that, this is just the opportunity for open additional discussion based on everything we talked about at this point. Is there other thoughts that you have?
Discuss,
Could be finance committee.
Yeah, that's what I was mentioning. It should be a subcommittee of the finance, I imagine. Are we closing out on this, on the revenue, on this kind of financial piece? Because I have a few notes I want to wait till the end, but I certainly want to share them. You're asking for vision, right? You're holding us here for a few hours because you want some type of long-term thing, right? So I'll offer mine. We've discussed this in finance, right? So every finance committee, we're looking 5, 10, we've discussed this and we're preparing for it. I wrote down, it is not a now problem because you said those words, and that's correct. I also wrote down, but it offers us the ability to have a now solution beginning. Very, very often in our jurisdictions, we deal with problems now. How do we fix it now? We have a unique opportunity here where we are years in front of the problem, which is exactly the planning I wish everybody would do, right? So we have the ability to now start the solution. And I think we have already started the solution with the reserve that you mentioned is 50 million. I had 3 points that I wrote down. The one is we need to, you all need to continue to plan and strategize for expansion just as you have been doing. Just know that the caution flag that I personally, one of 9 will throw is it will always be measured to feasibility, financial feasibility. What revenue is available to do the expansion priorities that you'd like? And I would never, with my one vote for expansion that exceeds financial fiscal capacity. I wouldn't. But that doesn't mean you should stop planning. It doesn't mean you should have all these goals. It shouldn't mean that you're doing it so prudently right now. I would say that my first point is to continue that. 2, I'm glad to see the slide that says the notes on sponsorship and advertising, because I believe this organization's goal should be fair replacement, should be advertising and sponsorship. That should be our goal. And I think we've seen fair generation is, correct me if I'm wrong, John, you probably know this in your head, is it 5 to 8 million in fair generation? But then there's fair collection costs that there's a delta. And I think the delta is 3 to 4 million, right? So if you start collecting fares, you don't make 8 million, you make 3.5 to 4. That should be this organization's goal, because as an elected official, and I will not speak for anyone else on this board, but for me, I am much more prepared to have the fare-free conversation with constituents when it's not paid for by the taxpayer, it's paid for by the sponsorship. That is a great place to be. And if you can generate $3.5 to $4 million and replace fare-free, to Andreas's point, that conversation is very important. And that should be our goal. Hey, your fare is free because of local businesses and local sponsors and local advertising and the work this organization is doing. Congratulations, fare-free regionalism opportunity. And that's my opinion. My third point is, Dave said it, we're going to have choices to make. We always make choices. Identify underperforming and or low value routes and services coming, right? So just as we talk about expansion, we should be talking about maximization, right? Maximization. If we want to expand, sometimes that might come at a cost of underperforming routes. And it might not just be add. It might be a add, remove. And maximizing the impact and value to our regional constituents. That's the decisions I think we're going to be making in the future. We may have the north-south BRT or the western expansion as a really high priority, but there might be some cost-saving measures on underperforming value that I think that we'll be able to recoup as we make those decisions going along. 3B on my last point is to continue to strengthen the reserve. I mentioned it. We have a $50 million reserve. Right now, we have the opportunity to keep pounding that account. So do it. Keep pounding the reserve. Put money away, put it away, put it away, put it away for the tougher decisions that are coming later. That's why in the finance committee, I keep advocating for that, and we're doing a great job with it. Short term, utilize to focus on grants that you're doing tremendously now. Every time you get a grant and pay for something, you're able to put money away. And I think that needs to continue to be our short-term focus to fix the long-term problem that we know is coming. Save as much money as you can now. And then the final one as a part of my third point is a $50 million reserve. I just mentioned it. It kicks off about $2 million a year in interest. I would build that reserve to 60 to 75, as high as you can get it to kick off the reserve. We just saw a 2.7 pull in capital annually. I think we can get to there in interest if we get to that reserve to the point it needs to be. And then what kind of place are you living in when you can utilize your reserve interest to pay for your capital improvements without touching your principal? That is an incredible world to live in. And on the revenue slide, you mentioned, I would just say the purple line dipped too quickly for me. Dipping into the CVTA reserves is not an option for me. As long as this group appoints me to be on the finance committee, I would never support that. Slower expansion, identifying maximization, and expansion will always be considered when feasible. And I cannot, I would not count on the dollar faucet. So I guess to close, I would say I would not count on expansion, then figure out how to pay for it. I would count on, we have all these great, wonderful goals. Let's prioritize them. What's financially feasible, and then we'll make those decisions. So there's every note that I made on what you brought.
If I could jump onto that and add, like, what letter of E3 were you on?
I was on 3C.
Yeah.
You're on 3D now.
3D. I think there needs to be a conversation around economic development partnerships in regards to what we're talking about for planning for economic growth in Henrico, Chesterfield, and the region. Because if we think about it, planning out where are we looking to grow, if you focus on a transit aspect or what could be part of a transit planning piece of that too, are we really talking about that regionally? Because I'm sure it's part of the conversation, but is it how we're starting the conversation? Because where we look at transit routes moving forward outwardly to get to the point where every jurisdiction of the CVTA is getting plans for transit, that starts with making sure that there's economic activity, or as Timmons Group calls the energy centers, for that to happen. And so if we're not creating that energy center where you're seeing that activity, then we're going to be following afterwards. And I know that major cities, this is what they do when they plan new stops. And this is where they focus on. We're going to put a stop here because we know that there's a lot of economic opportunity here. And that's where we can generate the revenue, jobs, and places for supporting that growth to support sustainably.
I concur. And on the Henrico side, just because I'm more familiar with it, that's exactly the conversation that we're having with regard to VCC's development and the Green City development, which is why it's important. That's why the Route 1 corridor is important to us, because we know the growth and development that VCC and Green City is going to bring, which is why, to me, it's why Route 1 is so important, to be able to draw folks from the city to that corridor, and quite frankly, from the north down to the city.
But even into the weeds, when we start talking about these economic development projects coming out of the ground, treating Spring Line, Green City, treating the right locations and centrality of transit stops as equal as we do fire lanes for buildings. And in the locality insisting in the approval processes that says, no, the stops, the shelters, all that's not going to be an afterthought. It's going to be central to this location, that from day one, when people are coming in, there's an expectation that this is fundamentally part of this place. And there's much more likelihood that they're going to enjoy that use.
Thinking, just pivoting off of your thought about tying to economic development opportunities. So one of the tools, and I'm not a finance expert, so I'm not going to speak to the availability and possibilities of this in different localities, but some communities use for funding long-term your transportation, your transit investments, particularly your larger BRT type investments, are transportation improvement districts. You know, so Miami, for example, has a transportation improvement district where there's a special property assessment for a rent mile. So that is, you know, if you think about, how you fund this gap long-term, are there opportunities to think about those if you have a regional conversation, probably kind of assembly, because that's perhaps a complex avenue, but that ties the value of the access that transit is providing to the land development that is occurring around it. And you've seen what's happened on Broad Street from land development around transit. So that's a possibility to consider.
Yeah.
Going back to the sponsorship and component, we have, and Adrian and I, this philosophical conversation. We provide service in some form to major employers that come to the region, and the ask is usually made, would you help contribute to that route? And I think we could be successful on that across the region. And that goes beyond this board. See, that goes to economic development entities amongst the region of establish that precedent so that we can build on that when you have a major employer coming that not only needs transit but expects transit, and we have to absorb that cost. It should be participating.
You're not talking about development, you're talking about companies. Is that what you're saying?
Companies, yes. Major
Amazon.
Employers. I'm not naming names, but yes.
So I have a question. As we talk about, and I agree that to get greater partnerships, looking at other models of revenue, generating additional revenue through partnership with the private sector in a sense, would certainly be something that when as they recognize the economic value to that level of partnershiping and our regional strategy for the transit, but also for economic growth, certainly would be an incentive. The question I have as it relates to economic growth being the catalyst for choices of expansion and what we would like to see happen from an economic growth perspective. Are we thinking that as we think regional transportation, we're thinking regional shares, formulas as it relates to economic growth as well on our arteries that we're using it as expansion to create this regional opportunity?
I mean, I think in terms of the scenarios we've drawn up, I don't think there's really been a dynamic assessment of, the ways that transit investment affects our economic development and growth opportunities. We've really just been pivoting off of fairly straightforward projections of cost and revenue. Are you thinking in terms of the ways that transit increases economic growth?
I've lost the sound again, so I'll see what I can do to get back in.
We can hear you.
No, we can hear you well.
Yes, she can't hear us.
Okay.
Any other discussion?
Yeah, I just want to bring something to a finer point of kind of what I alluded to earlier, which is it's my understanding that the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority includes a tax on Uber and Lyft, on rideshare programs as part of their funding, and I do believe it's dedicated to transit. We did not ask the General Assembly to consider that as part of the taxation mix for the CVTA. Again, we were early, we were trying to get something over the line. But it's always been in the back of my mind that would be a logical next place to go to expand our funding for transit, and particularly for the expansion of things like North-South BRT, et cetera. I don't know whether to say I would say we should analyze it, get a sense of what kind of revenue it would create, get a sense of how that aligns with our map here, and then start exploring whether or not it's something the elected officials from the region would support broadly, if it means, that, again, we taken regional funding to here. If we can get it to here, we can do all the things that we want to do to provide the services to our residents. And, you know, again, I think before we go to the well of our local budgets and fighting over what percentage is fair for a local share, I think we should run this. My recommendation would be that we research it and see if it's something we want to pursue seriously. And you know, we would have to go to the General Assembly for an amendment to the CBTA legislation. But you know, I think it would create significant revenue, and there's a lot of, I think, fairness in, you know, having, you know, if you're able to take a ride share to get to the game, you're subsidizing the folks who are using mass transit. Like there's, I think, economic value in that sort of relationship.
With the investigation strategy, and I would say that I can't imagine a scenario where I wouldn't be supportive of that. It's a perfect complement.
Agreed.
With vehicle use, first the option to use mass transportation to get to the arena, the stadium. I don't understand why that would not be a very sensible consideration.
Do we have any estimates of what that would look like?
Clearly not. I mean, no. I mean, I don't know that it would be hard to get to. I would imagine. And I was thinking about this, whether I don't know how the taxes are remitted from Uber and Lyft, you know, on this, because you do pay sales tax, right? So something's going to the state, some goes to the locality. So does each locality have a sense of how much local share sales tax is coming in that we could use as a baseline? But I just don't know if we know how much ride share is creating to know what, but I'm sure our finance teams can get to the bottom of it.
I know from previous conversations about this over the years have been concerns about origination and destination. If you have a jurisdiction where you're coming from that does not have to pay into it, and you're going to a place that does, where does the tax start? If there is a tax associated with it, versus if you're leaving, going to somewhere that's not in there. This is where the lawyers have fun.
Yeah,
but this is something to think about how we apply this, but more importantly, sometimes there are pushback against percentages of sales tax as rather just like a 25, 50 cent fee.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a surcharge like
flat fee. So it's per ride, and that makes it easier to calculate. More importantly, it's not dependent on if there's a surge or anything else that could be incorporated into there too.
Well, that's true, but we will lose the value of it. We love that discussion. If all 10 localities in the CBTA footprint, you would most likely be starting and ending in a CBTA locality, and then you just have to deal with, you know, what if you are crossing those lines? But amongst us, you know, you wouldn't care whether it originated in Richmond and ended in Rico or vice versa, because we're all putting that money into the pool to support regional transit.
New money is always a great thing to add to the conversation.
I would say the more rural, you probably don't have Uber anyway.
Yeah, not certainly not as common.
Yeah, vast majority of that probably predictions. Okay. Any other thoughts around our discussion today? We explored what we need to explore today.
Now that like Lincoln said that, I think we're done.
Ellen, were you able to get back on?
She's on.
Yes, I'm good.
I can answer your question about, that story is not in this graphic since it's more about operating and capital, but in terms of the zero fare partnership conversations, we are trying to get what those numbers are so we can share the economic impact to the area, because that's a big story that will sell to a lot of businesses.
Okay, thanks.
If there's no other conversation, questions, or discussion, then I think we toss it back to your board chair for any other business you need to deal with.
Did we hear from you? Did you get up and talk while I was outside?
John did.
Okay.
He contributed. Yeah.
Okay.
He backed up with
He made sure all of our charts were right. He did his work.
I mean, she did mention you as a presenter, so I was just.
I tried.
All right. So that's it for you guys? Okay, well, that was a hearty conversation. Yeah, I feel like we got, are there any other things that we want to share? I think the last meeting that we had, we didn't get into, was that was that official meeting or was it?
We had a special meeting.
Okay, yeah, but we didn't really get into the whole bus safety and bus stops thing.
No.
Do we have any plans? I know we talked about it, but what are you guys, what are you thinking?
So we're thinking several different things. We are looking to hire transit ambassadors to be out there as a customer service focus in addition to safety. We are putting procurement, as a matter of fact, we went out on the street last Friday, out there to potentially hire a firm to give us 4 armed security officers. And we would start off with 2 of those at the DTS and then 2 enrollment throughout the service area. I had a conversation with Chief Panuti with VCU Police, and they also have transit ambassadors, and they focus them on the pulse routes as well.
So is the focus then on stops that you feel like you have? Because how many stops do we have in general?
16.
Yeah. So four ambassadors is not, I mean, like 4 armed security people. I mean, is the idea to focus on the places where we see issues, where we have seen issues, or what?
Part of it.
Okay.
But the other part is they would try and split up and do more of our service areas. So you just never know. Yeah, we have an idea of where incidents have happened. Tony Carter does a good job of tracking that. So we would focus on that, but just as a presence throughout the system.
I know Dan and I had talked about this, lighting, like on the new shelters that we are building. Do they have the capacity to have cameras on it?
All of our current pulse stations have cameras on them.
Okay.
We have cameras at the DTS as well.
Okay, but what about just general shelters, like new ones that we putting up?
Do not have that. And that's the other thing, like you brought that up. We are going to get a dedicated person for CCTV as a person that just will watch all of our cameras throughout the system. Buses, because we have live feeds now where we can to any bus at any time. So we're going to dedicate a room and hire personnel to. That's all they're going to do all day. Those. But as far as the new shelters with cameras, that's not something that we've talked about. But for sure, our DTS has it as well as our BRT stations.
All right, so Andreas and Dan, then I'll.
I just think in the city, there is a need to think about more street light coverage rather than the big, tall 30-foot high in the air plus street lights that have that dispersion that gets really muted when you have trees, which we have a problem with. And so getting more the 14-foot so you can actually have street level access to lighting. Thinking about smart city technology too that could allow for cameras to be installed and or Wi-Fi and or the ability of turning on the light brighter if needed for brighter security around bus stops specifically so you have better view. I know safety in regards to that's been a concern, especially in Southside where those do not exist. And so there's again a coordination around public infrastructure around where we are locating bus stops. And the challenge I have is that we've been moving bus stops pretty fluidly in location on blocks, mid-block, end block, moving things around. Does our new bus shelter focus allow for easy movability of bus stops? Or are we really being permanent or more semi-permanent for multi-years at a time? Just because it does impact planning and other aspects too. Because I'm just thinking through how we are matching our investment from GRTC from a City of Richmond neighborhood level for the accessibility piece.
And we also are piloting solar power plants because that's the concern that our operators have as well from a safety aspect, but also to see the customers at night. Sometimes you see we get a lot of pass-up passengers. Part of that is because they don't realize that person. Yeah. Also working with the churches for additional lighting at our bus stops and tree trees.
Yeah.
believe we have, I think I saw a discussion, there's a security safety position that's been created. I don't know if the person's been on board yet, but it's underway. And I would advocate for one of the key priorities for that would be exactly what was just discussed. I think when we budget for a new, we'll want a heat map of where we're having issues, right? That's the first step. Two, I would advocate that when we budget for a stop, a shelter, like whatever the cost is for the bench and the shelter, we should add 2 solar lights. They make an unbelievable product right now, and we're using them heavily with these solar lights. Inexpensive. I think I've been told under 10 grand for a light pole. I mean, it's not a huge piece, but I would advocate for lighting. I would advocate for this person to consider heavily what Mr. Nelson mentioned. We had a discussion about it, cameras. And I'd also advocate for them to be as overt as possible. Literally a sign that says smile, you're on camera. I want, everybody should see it. I think our riders would feel good about it. And I think the folks that are intent on doing harm would be dissuaded by it. And I think cameras are critically important. And I would advocate for a standard bus shop to have a bench, a shelter, a garbage can, a camera, and 2 solar lights. Like that should be our standard package. I think today's day and age allows for it.
Not only allows for it, but the precipitous drop in costs of technology is.
I love the fact that you talk about monitors. And then the last thing I'll say is I am in the security world, and I would put a much heavier emphasis on camera capture and monitoring and immediate dispatch to a law enforcement officer than I would an armed security force roving around with gun. I don't know. I think that the VCU, certainly I think the city's fortunate. The VCU corridor in the city are in close proximity. There's police officers nearby. I would advocate for that camera operation, camera capture, and CCTV monitoring more so than armed officers.
And on our new buses, we also have 2 monitors that show the passengers that they are on camera. So I'm not sure if the plan is to retrofit any of our old buses, but we definitely started that program so they see themselves on camera.
Yeah, I think the key piece of that is to make it as widely known as possible. Hey, look, there's a camera. No covert camera is necessary here.
And we also put additional signs down our DTS that they were being videoed as well, because it only had 2 signs. And thankfully to security officer at City of Richmond, he said we needed additional signs. So we worked those in.
So can we think about that from a budget perspective, I guess, with the next budget? I mean, just kind of looking at maybe beefing up the security dollars a little bit. I mean, just with some of these ideas.
And we do get safety security dollars from federal as well. That's some of the money that we will be.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is we basically, risk management has been reading safety and security because historically have been more about risk management and being reactive. So now putting an assistant director whose her sole focus for the next 6 months is to build a safety and security program looking at other entities. Putting in strategically looking at the heat maps, the security on those routes and those stops. I will say that most incidents have happened during the day. The lighting hasn't necessarily been an issue, but all of the new shelters that are going in all have solar lights. So that will happen. And then additionally, we want to do an ambassador program to benefit that will be our whole system just for purposes of presence. Right. I think the issue with the shelters might be Wi-Fi. Is that something we can look into?
Certainly, I'm sure it's an IT issue. Power is probably an issue, but probably less than Wi-Fi. When you draw power off a solar light, is that even electronically possible?
Yeah, storage probably too for it at night.
I'm sure data storage. I'm sure, but that's exactly what I would hope that she would be able to start. You know, her report should be here are the obstacles I have, and one of them is certainly going to be Wi-Fi. But like Dave's mentioned, the technology today, anything's possible.
All right. Or anything else?
This is completely sort of in the rails of what Dan was talking about on sponsorship and advertising. And it's also in a vacuum of what's already being done. But you just popped out 1,600. Okay, so 1,600 stops. If we were just to say, adopt a whatever shelter, if you had 300 per year revenue. That's $400,000 right there, and on average. And if you have some of these shelters that are corporate, just no other, not on the bus, not any other forms of advertising, but basically shelter sponsorship, I'm thinking it's more like $500 would be the number. That's $800,000 a year just by itself. So I think to the point of looking ahead at how things are going to be challenging on the revenue side, that we want to be creative about where that revenue is just sitting and not being taken in yet. Because I think you have a lot of advocates out there that would pick up some of the, just going to have to be a strategy of process getting there. I mean, you'd have families, this strip of whatever, adopt a highway. The Anderson family has adopted this highway. Well, you'd have, I think, some level of individual support where people are willing to do that because of that. That's part of their community service.
Yeah.
That's the other thing.
We have probably somewhere close to that, I think. As far as stops that have been adopted.
So what I'm doing is adding dollars to it.
Yeah,
You are.
Right, that's the time and effort. Yeah, so the issue with that was if your name's on it, well, it's possibility. It's not necessarily advertising. You're not even advertising, you're just strictly adopting.
I'm saying that somebody in return for, let's say Timmons, in return for the spring line stops would pay X $1,000 a year, whatever. And that if that were to average out for the system, $300 to $500 per stop, that's a whole lot of money. That's my point. I'm just thinking to the end game here, but that's what I'm saying. It's not just adopt to keep it nice, to keep whatever. It is to own the advertising that says this is stop number 36 is Dave's spot.
We also consider discussing adding trash cans or recycling. I get a lot of cleanliness complaints around the bus stops because people get there and they have nowhere to put it. And just thinking through basic fundamental public infrastructure is becoming a problem. Well, we might not get every stop adopted. What about the ones that are high volume too?
Just putting trash cans. So all those will have, the issue with the trash can placements is that they have to be on a city line today because we don't have a separate trash can pickup. And Ride's taking on their own brewing monster of trash can emptying.
It's an ongoing conversation and a struggle, but it is a problem we need to address.
All right, is that it?
So, Mr. Nelson.
Me?
Nelson, Mr. Chair, on the north-south bus rapid transit, have we finalized the route yet?
Our first public meeting was last evening, which talked about the station locations and the alignment. So not been completely finalized yet. More the downtown area that's still being determined. But I believe that their recommendation is the 8th and 9th Street corridor.
So am I to understand that the recommendation right now will be coming back to the board for final approval, but are we looking at Route 1 or are we looking at going Midlothian, Hall Street?
It's Hull Street, Belt to Midlothian is the corridor. So that part has been decided. It's all the way from Chamberlain, Azalea, through the city center, 9th Street Bridge, Hull Street, Belt, Midlothian.
So it does not go Route 1 south, turns and heads out on Midlothian.
And that did go to the board last October.
Subcommittee about leadership. Did y'all meet yet? Okay, all right. Okay, so the idea is to bring something for October. Okay. All right. Well, I know y'all got busy days, so I'm not gonna try to hold you any longer. Anybody else have any final comments?
Just remember, October's meeting will be delayed by 1 week because of shareholders.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you, staff, team. A lot of information for all the great work. Can y'all shoot us some slides with the accomplishments on it, please? All right, until next time. See you. Meeting adjourned.
22nd.